Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We have arrived at the final session of today, so thank you very much for sticking it out. I hope it's worth it. I'm sure it's worth it, because now we'll be moving to more recent developments in the political sphere of Sudan and Ethiopia. And for this, we have asked Jan Abbink, Professor of Politics and Governance at the African Studies Centre. Professor Abbink is an anthropologist and historian also. I think virtually all of our speakers were anthropologists and historians. Who carries out research on the history and cultures of the Horn of Africa. And in particular, he is renowned for his expertise on Ethiopia, with a focus on various themes including governance, political culture, religion, livelihoods, conflict, and I've just heard demography. I also heard he speaks very good German, as an aside. Yeah, exactly.
I will spare you the German today. I will do it in English.
Professor Abbink.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me. We have heard 3 excellent lectures today already, and I must say there will be a hard act to follow for me. And I have to warn you, I will not mention even once the term decolonizing African studies. I'm sorry for that. But I will say this, I fully support this intellectual endeavor, of course. We need to solve the biases and problems of this decolonizing, of these colonized structures by doing better research, by sticking to the best canons of research ever, and by neutralizing institutional power difference between us and Africa and other places. But for the rest, I will really bypass the issue and go to a very, let's say, hands-on story on politics and governance in the Horn of Africa, in Sudan and Ethiopia. Because these are 2 crucial countries in Africa, of course, who do not feature much in the discourse of 60 years of independence that we assess in these conferences. Sudan, because it was the first African country, sub-Saharan African country, gaining independence on January 1, 1956. So well before the big wave of the 60s, of 1960. Ethiopia, likely the oldest state formation in sub-Saharan Africa, was of course never effectively colonized, and kept much of its own epistemological, or let's say intellectual traditions. Both countries also show great continuity with pre-European contact, pre-colonial cultures and histories. They have a remarkable continuity which by far surpasses even the history of Europe. And they are very conscious of that. I will compare today the very recent political trajectories of these 2 countries, often intertwined in their history, and assess the remarkable events that have occurred there in the past 2 years. Indeed, Sudan and Ethiopia have proven to be somewhat of a surprise. On the flow of persistent public protests, the dictatorial and stifling ideological regimes were removed in 2019, Sudan, in 2018, Ethiopia. Unexpectedly, more democratically minded leaders were ushered in, promising a new political inclusiveness, social peace, and also economic change. For those who have followed events there, it was difficult to hide our admiration for the youth protest movements and for the other social forces that helped the new leaders come to power. The changes we saw in the political domain and in the general atmosphere of the countries are really significant, if not spectacular. And the stories of many of those involved are really impressive. I will give an overview of the 2 episodes of political upheaval and renewal and relate them to the prevailing political cultures in the 2 countries. But then I will ask the key question of whether these political changes will hold or whether they might be neutralized, absorbed, for example, by time-tested structures of patronage, elite or party interest or conflict lines. Might protests and regime or elite change towards more democratic, open structures and socio-economic reform be reversed by what some would call the deep state or by political practices that kept the former leaders in the saddle for so long? Is what we see a voluntarist change depending on a couple of charismatic and well-intentioned individuals and those media-skilled youth contestants, or is a process emerging towards structural or systemic change? That would be a general, nice comparative research question also. And what would be the wider long-term preconditions for such structural change? I here touch, as you have heard, lightly on an old debate in social science, that of structure and agency. It's of course a somewhat artificial opposition, but it's narratively attractive. No doubt, collective political agency is cherished by the people themselves and has its role. It has pressured governments. But, to strongly simplify a complex question, can agency beat structure? A central point in my answering the question will be to take into account demographics. Chances to attain political stability and free status, or broader democratization, and also economic change in terms of raising the general level of wealth and productivity, may occur in a more structural fashion if a number of demographic features coincide and are upheld and stimulated by a resolute government policy. So I contend that statistical population data on a medium and longer range are quite relevant for assessing chances of political system change, apart from and next to analyzing political narratives, ideological debates, protest events. Despite the game-changing massive protests in Sudan and Ethiopia, structural political change will likely not be decisively pushed through unless demographic patterns in both countries shift. And I'm afraid that will take a few decades. Cautious optimism regarding Sudan and Ethiopia would be, of course, in order. But on what can it be based, is the question. Political demography shows us the longer-term basic population trends influencing or signaling political and economic developments in sub-Saharan and other countries in Africa in unexpected ways. Research attention to such demographic factors is growing, as we see from the debates in economics and development studies on the often mentioned demographic dividends, well known, it's the economic argument. While we can recognize the connectedness of economic factors with demographic trends, I here limit myself only to the political demography, meaning what do demographic features say about instability, revolt, delayed openings towards democracy and civic rights and general freedoms? It's a subfield in rapid development. I will not mention names, but it's rapidly taking up, and can, as I said, provide new insights on long-term trends when combined with the conventional historical and political analysis. Since Africa's wave of independence around 1960, scholarly analysis of its politics and governance have focused primarily on ideological narratives, hegemonic structures, insurgencies, inequality, and governance conditions, and much less on the analysis of such statistical time series. Perhaps economic data and GDP analysis are an exception. So I would say, I contend here again, that one theory called the age structural theory, especially developed by a couple of European, American, but also some African scholars, including in Ethiopia, can profitably be related to interpreting the movements of social protest, political upheaval, and chances for democratic breakthrough. As measured, for instance, if you want to measure that, this breakthrough, you could look at the indexes by the Freedom House annual measurements and so forth, on media freedom, civic freedom, judicial independence, and so forth. The age structural theory means relating the characteristics of a country's population composition with these societal and political trends. This theory, of course, has shot into prominence by its focus on the nature and impact of the so-called youth bulge a couple of years ago, but it reflects much more than that, because that's a focus we should really abandon. It's not only the youth bulge as such. To assess it, the age structural pattern of a country, we look at 4 criteria. Median age, so the age that divides the population into numerically similar parts, 50% below, 50% above. Fertility ratio, high population growth in general, in the sense of disturbing the relation between young people versus working age people, and correspondingly the dependency ratio, the people dependent on the working people. While the model was tested in many contexts and its predictions and outcomes are fairly constant, it is not a causal explanation of political processes, but primarily gives timed expectations. But they are important nevertheless. As such, it is a necessary but not sufficient element in predicting political change and democratization. I refrain from problematizing these concepts. I mean, I go straight on to the context as they are used in these theories. There could be a lot of discussion about how they are conceptualized in the African context. I'm sorry, I have to skip that. An analysis, however, not heeding demographic statistics, I would say, underlying such political and social processes, is always incomplete, not to say naive. Regarding Sudan and Ethiopia, my thesis is in brief that also there A very young population with a median age well below 25, 26 years, high fertility and high dependency ratio will not easily show durable political stability and democratization or freedom scores, nor sustain broad economic growth. Before I go into this, I will give a brief overview of the events in Ethiopia and Sudan. And they were really remarkable in 2 years. But who could have thought that in two of the most autocratic regimes, this change would happen? In Ethiopia, it started in November 2015 by a very simple thing: the authorities confiscating a football playing field of Oromo youths in Ginchi town. The youngsters protested, and they said, "No, you are not going to give our football field to the investors. We want to keep this." And from this tiny event, the whole thing started and spiraled out across the region of Oromia, but also again into Amhara region, two of the largest and most populous regions, and accumulated grievances more and more. Not only land grabbing, but also humiliation, ethnic discrimination, land confiscation issues, unemployment, nepotism and corruption, as they perceived it, were motives to fuel people to go to the streets. And it was very, very massive. Many people formulated their grievances in ethno-regional terms or in ethnic terms, and in some areas even people started arming themselves. The protest led, of course, to state repression, arrests and killings that did not stop over the years. In the course of this movement, solidarity across ethnic regions also emerged. That was very important, especially in the first year. And then simultaneously, within the single ruling party, the EPRDF in Ethiopia, there were disagreements about the division of power, the division of the economic spoils, and policy issues, as well as the power relationship within the coalition of four parties. Anyway, things started to spiral out of control, and the EPRDF saw they had to do something. They tried to move towards reform to accommodate these internal and external critics at the price of protest containment and of enforcing party discipline. That this price had become too high. By late 2017, hundreds of demonstrators had been killed and thousands of arrests had been made. Internet was shut down frequently, business life suffered. Centrifugal tendency threatened the grip of the ruling party and the elites on the economy also. Then in February 2018, in the party itself, a new prime minister was elected, the young Abiy Ahmed, a regime functionary, but a very critical voice, and emerging from a wider group of Oromo and Amhara region reformists within the party. And we can really say his assuming power in April 2018 meant a watershed of change. He proceeded to irreversibly change the party and the relationship between its four constituents, abolished repressive laws, made promises to the youthful demonstrators, liberated the press and civil society, opened dialogue in a broad societal process. He also announced free and fair elections for this year. They will be held in August. So he turned around the style of politics in Ethiopia and vocally pleaded for a reversal of Ethiopia's hierarchical and autocratic political culture towards inclusiveness and synergy. That was unprecedented and was partly, for a large part, the result of these popular protests. And he was also conscious of responding to this. He said in one of his speeches in 2018, "The questions of the youth are not solely one of economy and equitable benefits. We believe they are also about justice and democracy." I think he was right there. But his opening in the political system and embarking on a new course did not mean that the outcome, also for himself and for his party, was ensured. The first disagreements and grumblings soon started among people and organizations who chose to stick to an agenda of past grievances and group thinking, pleading for their own so-called constituency, rather than playing their parts in the renewal of national politics. Ghosts from the past came back, the results of 27 years of ethnic thinking and politicking since 1991, the new regime, it re-emerged, and this led to disagreements and violent action, displacements, expulsions, mob killings, border clashes. There was exclusion of people based on so-called ethnic differences and interests presumed to be under threat. Paradoxically, democracy in Ethiopia was then, we can see, interpreted by political actors, also the opponents, the demonstrators, in ethnic terms, as the right to express oneself ethnically, rather than in civic national terms. Several Opposition forces, supported by massive and often misleading and trolling social media campaigns, subscribe to this agenda of division and aggression. Ethno-territorial identity appeals turned almost into mimetic group rivalry on the local level. Many ethno-elites came to see the state more as a resource machine to be put to work for them and not for others. It would be a mistake indeed also to think that all these protesters and rebels and revolting people were all noble Democrats. That was not the case at all. Unless spectacularly successful government policies in this day and age, in this opening, in this window of opportunity, in the field of economics, education, land distribution, and political representation take root, unless, I think Ethiopia will be faced with ongoing socio-political unrest for the near future, with large groups of unemployed and restless people and no consolidated democratic structures. That is the danger. That is at least also what the current population profile of the country, before the opening of the demographic window, which I will talk about in a minute, would lead us to suspect. So there we have the relevance of age structural theory. A complicating factor will be that ethnic demographics will become more and more important. What about Sudan? Sudan also saw a remarkable and very unexpected turnaround with the fall of the long-term autocratic President Mohamed al-Bashir last year, April. A popular revolt had begun in December 2018 in Damazin and Atbara, these two cities, and then spreading to other places, including Khartoum, initiating a new round in a cycle of insurgencies, which already was seen in the previous decades. It spread to the other cities and was predominantly non-violent, mostly non-violent. We saw also accumulation of grievances and pent-up feelings coming out. A key role was played by young people and by the Sudan Professionals Association, a group of independent professional unions. One of the key slogans, of course, became "Das gut bas," just go, just fall, that's all, so to speak, to the government. And because the government was seen as really long, having outlived its expiry date, 30 years in power, al-Bashir, 30 years. What seemed to have begun as so-called riots against bad living conditions and so forth, became a protest against the entire political system. It was obvious that these were not bread riots, as some global media were eager to describe them. Again, we talk about bread riots, it's not bread riots, it's a total misperception of what was going on. Much more was involved: quest for freedom, breathing space, representation, anti-corruption, and against the suppression or keeping down of young people and minorities, and also, very notably, for the release of women from public restrictions and marginalization. Indeed, from the start, the strong presence and involvement of women was obvious in the Sudan's protest, and there are beautiful films and scenes and narratives on YouTube and other internet sources highlighting this. And we all, of course, know the famous picture by, I'm not keeping up with my PowerPoint, huh? Very bad. Protests in Ethiopia, in both the big regions. I want to show you the picture which became the icon, of course. Huh? The icon is this lady, obviously. You know, you all know her, Mrs. Salah, dressed in a highly symbolic outfit, standing on top of a car, reciting a powerful protest poem. She represented a generation born after al-Bashir's coup d'etat in 1989, that had known no other regime and no other president, and had become totally sick of lies, abuse, and violence. And women indeed became a motor of revolt and voiced an array of grievances. Rarely, if at all, in the protest movement were religious issues raised, except that protesters rallied against the political abuse of religion, political Islam, by the Islamist regime of al-Bashir, which had imposed such repressive laws on female dress, on public behavior of women, and so forth. This was all categorically rejected in the revolt. The response, of course, of the regime was violence, dispersal, killing people. On 3 June last year, more than 100 people were killed, shot dead in Khartoum. Thousands arrested, internet closed off, similar scenario as in Ethiopia. Of course, here it did not work. The unexpected happened. Mohamed al-Bashir was deposed on 11 April by a somewhat frightened army elite, choosing to sacrifice him to save their power. That is, of course, a thing to keep in mind. After a difficult process of negotiation between civilian pressure groups and demonstrators, united in the Forces for Freedom and Change, with the Army Council, a transitional sovereign council was inaugurated in August last year, with 5 army key leaders, 6 civilians, and including 2 women, to prepare for the elections. A popular and capable economist, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, was appointed prime minister, a man untainted by collaboration with the al-Bashir regime, a guy of great integrity and skills, and started reforms. After the installment of this transitional cabinet and the repeal of repressive laws, women also started to engage much more visibly in public life, including setting up their own football clubs, which had been forbidden for 30 years. Prime Minister Abdallah started also negotiations with the insurgents in Darfur and in Blue Nile, the 2 troubled regions. And even on last week, Friday, 24 January, a deal was reached to end hostilities. So, the Sudanese people seem to have reached also a major political victory, despite that the system was not totally overhauled, of course. Most impressive in the past 1.5 years was the unity of purpose and the persistence of demonstrators, many of whom, after the new government was installed, turned to social and civic initiatives via citizens' councils and all kinds of activities to concretely improve living conditions and do what the state had omitted to do for many years. It was also a very interesting follow-up of this revolt. Now, in both countries, we saw a story of collective action of youths and social movements with transformative impact and, as a result, some kind of regime change. The youth activists and other protesters may be forgiven for thinking that they have changed the course of history, that their agency has run supreme, and that future policies of the new transitional governments must obey their wishes and demands. Is that view justified? Has, to put it simply again, agency won over structure? Up to a point, as we saw. But the structures are resilient. There are long-term factors influencing politics and economic development. I have a list here, I won't mention them. It's, of course, authority structures, foreign support to political actors, foreign interference, collective representations in the societal order, but above all, I would like to highlight, of course, demographic characteristics, demography. What's the underlying demography? The map made by Tom and Nel Vink is a very helpful overview of what is happening in all kinds of underlying demographic, economic, and other quantitative data in Africa. I partly connect to that, and I focus specifically into this age structural theory, which has a contribution to make. As I said earlier, population features have a relation to social and political peace, and democratization and indexes of freedom development in a country. A population structure skewed towards a high proportion of young dependent people, what is labeled as not mature by theorists, was shown by research to be not so favorable to democratic, durable development and stability, but more to recurring, periodic contestation and conflict. As I noted before, the 4 features, median age, fertility rate, population growth per annum, and dependency ratio are good indicators, indexes. And I have a nice graph, which I should now suppose here are the 2 leaders. Here's the graph. Yes, that's the graph. This is a general AST graph to start with. When you look at the relationship between fertility rate and median age. In this table, you see that on the left, the black squares are the sub-Saharan African countries. All in the pre-demographic window. The contention of the theory is that when you enter the demographic window with a lower fertility rate of 2.8, which is the dotted line, as well as a higher median age towards the right, you get a kind of unwitting process of societal and political opening up, stability, possibility. This was, if you see it, the 2 black blocks on the right side in the demographic window are Mauritius and Tunisia. Well, they are the most advanced in that line of, let's say, political opening, freedom scores, and stability. So there is some kind of corroboration for this kind of analysis. The lighter squares these are all from various other countries and various other continents. So the phase, demographic window phase, which would lead to durable stability and democratic development, usually opens up when the median age of population is about 26, 27 years. When a population under 14 years of age is below 30%, and the older people above 65 not higher than 15%. Most African countries are also far above the dependency ratio of 1.2 that is usually correlated with this same pattern. So, although fertility decline is slowly setting in Africa, we are looking at the facts. I'm not posing any value judgments about this. We look at the facts here for the time being. Most countries, except in North Africa and a few island states, are not soon going to reach that window, which we see here. And this has these political and economic consequences. In such demographic conditions, the trigger to revolt and to instability is often, what keeps the revolts going is often, you know, not only discontent about unemployment and youth vagrancy and so forth, but also the perceptions of a state elite's unfair and politically corrupt behavior. That is also the trigger. Think of Tunisia, think of Sudan and Ethiopia. That sets into motion movements, you know, towards change. So our two countries, how do they fare? They share much in common in demographic profile, although Ethiopia has almost 3 times the population of Sudan, about 113 million. In 1960, Ethiopia had 22.1 million people. The median age in Ethiopia is 19.5 years. In 2030, it's predicted to be 23 years. Population growth is about 2.6%, 2.7. That means a doubling almost every 25 years. The fertility rate was slowly going down, but is still 4.3%. The dependency ratio, the percentage of people dependent on working people in Ethiopia is 76.8%, dependent people on working people. According to the political demographer Richard Sincora, his analysis and case studies, the demographic window in general opens up when the median age is, as I said, about 26, 27. Ethiopia will reach this only in, well, about 2040, 2045. Then the theory predicts durable, you know, stability or you know, predictable democratic developments will occur. Sudan has about 43.3 million people. In 1960, it has 7.5 million people. So spectacular growth also. Median age almost the same as in Ethiopia, 19.7 years. Annual population growth 2.4. Also declining. The highest was in 1992. It was 3.85%. Fertility rate in Sudan is about 4.4. And the dependency ratio almost the same as in Ethiopia, 76.9%, also very high. So it's a very similar pattern. Also for Sudan, the median age of 26, 27 years is still far away. Probably the same as in Ethiopia, 2040, 2045. And the dependency ratio is equally problematic in view of the large young population and the high population growth, outstripping economic absorptive capacity. In general, this also means, and this is also a relevant body of data, that for both countries the tax base is very small. But in a country with a higher number of youth and an unbalanced structure, you need state investments in infrastructure, facilities, education, trade facilitation, public management, technology. This is precisely what is needed. So, AST theory predicts that in the case of Sudan and Ethiopia, with these high indicators, pressures and changes in the manifest political domain will not durably enhance stability, democracy, and civic freedoms yet, before these two countries reach that demographic window. It's a very nice hypothesis to study and to follow over the coming years. Because the demographic window entry for both is expected to be in about 2040. Unless policies radically change and make a rapid transformative impact on society and on the behavior of people, then it might be advanced. History shows us that such radical policy change is pretty unlikely, precarious. Despite that, under current leadership in both countries, the chances are greater than ever. So the demographic window will arrive, but not as soon as people think. Interestingly, opposition parties and protesters in Ethiopia, and to a lesser extent Sudan, do hardly emphasize the need for massive transformative policies for the nation. They are still largely focused on perceived group interests and humiliation and short-term concerns in a mixture of ethnic canvassing and trying to secure jobs for their own group and for their self-appointed elites. It's in a way, you might say that what has started as protest was taken over by the government, by the Prime Minister, and then his quite radical policies are not tuned into by the population. They have either no total knowledge of it or try to revert them back to their own so-called constituency. That is also a very interesting process to follow in the near future. So we have seen in my first part of the presentation that as a result of these protest and reform efforts, fueled by the youthful cohorts and reformist leaders, advances were indeed made in the sphere of governance. There is more openness, there is a transitional government, there are legal reforms, there is better economic policy, and there is more civic and democratic freedoms, although very precarious. And these are partly the result, an achievement of voluntarist action, of agency. But clearly, both Ethiopia and Sudan are not yet in an age-structural transition phase. And this is why stability and broad growth are unlikely and perhaps even cannot yet occur. The gains are precarious and reversible due to, as some proponents of the theory would say, due to objective demographic characteristics. Often the prediction of instability is made with reference to what I said was the big youth bulge. Yeah? But this in itself is not a sufficient causal factor. Crucial for it to become relevant and to explode, so to speak, is state capacity and government response. So Sudan and Ethiopia's country profiles caution us and suggest that it is unlikely that sustained democratization, increase of institutional freedoms, civic freedoms, and system predictability will materialize in the coming 15 to 20 years, unfortunately. They will continue to see instability, youth contestation, and revolts, along with conditions of significant unemployment and economic uncertainty before they reach that demographic window that will stabilize into such freedoms and more democratic deliberative structures. And this despite these being the conscious aims, of course, of many of the protesting youths. Do Sudan and Ethiopia now really face the same trajectory? There are similarities, of course, but there are also differences between Sudan and Ethiopia. And here I revert back to these conditions which may impinge on the advancement of the demographic window, the political dynamics in itself. And there are differences. I mentioned 4 points between the two countries. First, in Sudan's protest, ethnicity and its demographics did not play such a divisive role. When the al-Bashir regime last year tried to play out the demonstrators against each other when he was still in power, for example, appealing to the youngsters of central Sudan riverain populations, the Khartoum people, warning them, do not be exploited by the Darfuri rebel fronts, he said to them. The street response was, you arrogant racists, we are all Darfur, they said. In Ethiopia, ethnic interests were not the only driving factor in the initial rural mass protests, and new alliances were made across regions, across ethnic groups, between loosely organized youths, Oromo youth groups voiced support for Amhara youth in 2017, and vice versa. Even in the choice of the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, a part of the old coalition collaborated in thwarting the dominant TPLF and voting him into power. However, almost 2 years after the government change, ethnicization of protest agendas in Ethiopia has become a bit problematic and has entered into the mainstream of opposition parties now jostling for power, jostling to participate in the new elections in August 2020. Second point, in Sudan, really, young women, organized and non-organized, were much more visible and perhaps much more instrumental in the demonstration, in the mass demonstrations in the cities, and also in media activities. It does not mean to say that Ethiopian women were not involved, but they chose different venues, different ways to be active, to voice their protests. And on the streets, they were a visible minority. They had not such an impact. There is no such an icon as Salah, which we saw in the picture. Also because most of the protests occurred in rural areas in Ethiopia, and not so much in the capital and the other big cities. That came only much later. Third point, in Sudan, professional organizations, the SPA, as I mentioned in the beginning, and non-ethnic civil society groups led the protests. and could refer to a long history of organized opposition going back to the 1960s, including trade unions. In Ethiopia, protests were more local, less organized in that respect, dispersed among unemployed school leavers, the rural poor, disadvantaged young peasants, would-be ethnic elites, and several diaspora activists via social media, and also among small, marginalized ethnic minorities in the south and west. So again, a kind of difference. The fourth and last point of difference, the narrative of national unity and joint destiny, which re-emerged in Sudan, but only hesitantly so in Ethiopia, where after initial feelings of shared grievances and the ethnicized and aspiring regional elites came to fuel ethno-regional agendas during 2019, that was the big difference. These ethnic elites in Ethiopia did hardly formulate clear civic rights and economic programs on the national level. Remarkably, many of them failed to tune into the discourse of unity and project of a joint future that was emerging, for example, under the aegis of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. So ethnic power struggles, in a way, re-emerged, and that is a kind of a difference with Sudan. So I move to a concluding review. The political changes generated by youthful protesters and other groups in both Sudan and Ethiopia have mesmerized the world, and again gave the lie to a position, often seen among donor countries, that authoritarian regimes in Africa and elsewhere are, they are stable, and that we should just work with them. But the regimes were toppled, they were not so stable, they restructured, radical political change was announced and achieved, and a new style of politics, a new ethos of politics was emerging. The engine behind this was this new young generational cohort that grew up in the last 25, 28 years since the previous regime changes in Sudan, 1989, and Ethiopia, 1991. This generation had come to maturity, but saw itself stagnated, blocked, and with very limited future prospects. They were fed up, and they acted on it. But this cohort pointed to a specific demographic situation, large numbers, low median age, high dependency ratios, constituting that limiting factor, acting to restrain, perhaps, a durable political breakthrough on the short term, and likely to perpetuate more than we expect instability. Indeed, Sudan and Ethiopia share a similar political demographic profile, as we saw, as to these four criteria of high fertility, low median age, high population growth, and high dependency ratio, as well as on the timing of the demographic window. So this combination has a direct correlation with political variables, even apart from the economic ones, which I today excluded from discussion. I also excluded, of course, environmental factors, which may pose an even more serious long-term threat to equitable development and stability for large numbers of people in Africa to come. The political demographic obstacles need not be a cause for despair, as we now might think, because as we have seen, and it was recently admitted by proponents of this age structural theory, factors in the realm of politics and governance can decisively impinge on the trajectory. Nonetheless, this demands decisive and interventionist government policies affecting choices and preferences of people, as well as improving educational levels for both men and women, policies which have so far often lacked in sustenance and in persistence. The demographic profile, as I said, limits the domestic tax base, and that's going to be an issue, of course, because the investments are absolutely needed to bring that demographic window closer. Rapid population growth in general does usually increase resource competition, but does not directly cause big conflicts. The relationship between population change and political conflict is always mediated by, as I suggested, by state capacity and by state response. Although initially, local conflicts often occur in such conditions. What we see today in the Sahel, the youngest region in Africa, and also the most conflict-ridden, is large-scale conflict due to rather spectacular failure of state institutions. Essential to study and assess the youthfulness of a country is in its tendency to enhance conflict is, however, to look at their nature. What kind of conflicts are they? As Richard Sincora noted last year, three key factors complicate the relationship between age structure and interstate conflict. Conflict type, is it civil or territorial? Conflict history in a country, maybe going a long way back, and the conflict spillover of cross-border conflicts coming from neighboring countries. Think of, in our case, South Sudan or Somalia. There is an impact there. If we compare Sudan and Ethiopia, we have reason to be a bit more optimistic about Sudan, perhaps, than about Ethiopia, in moving towards a kind of demographic window and more institutionalized, democratic, predictable governance in the coming 15 to 20 years. One reason may be the more encompassing, non-ethnic and more gender-sensitive agenda of revolt in Sudan, and the consciousness among the Sudanese protesters up to this day of having to spring into action again when things go wrong. In Ethiopia, the longevity and durability of ethno-ideological structures which have been pressed upon the generation born after 1991, inculcated, so to speak, knowing nothing else than politicized ethnicity and victimology discourse along ethnic lines, they are much more impactful. In addition, embodied ethno-regional diversity itself in Ethiopia may be more deep-rooted. Come what may, the ordinary people of both countries have shown their agency and their power to press for change and impact on the political structures of their countries. The generation that grew up knowing only one party and one leader, as I said, had enough and rose. While much of that change, forged in painful sacrifice and with high costs, is vulnerable to being absorbed or neutralized by structures and resistant elites, things will no more be the same in either country. Of course, institutions and political structures in Africa are often still too much tied up with specific persons or with particular interest groups. Think of the neo-patrimonialist theory. But this makes them also more amenable to certain alternatives and changes of policy. Still, and that has been the gist of my talk, demographic facts remain an objective limiting factor. This goes for Sudan and Ethiopia, and perhaps also for Africa and other places on the globe as a whole. What I'm saying is that the political sociology of African governance and politics would do well to recognize that underlying population facts and numbers are tenacious, exert long-term influence, and cannot quickly be vanquished by voluntarist action and grievance-led protest only. To conclude, we might say demography rules. But still, as I hope I make clear, demography is not entirely unaccountable. Decisive politics can impact upon it, and that is where good leadership, inclusive civic action, and popular pressure remain essential. Agency, when claimed and enacted in a public domain, can enforce, or at least initiate, the change of structures, and the movement towards a demographic window will reinforce it. Sudan and Ethiopia have shown hopeful openings for this and are making history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for telling us indeed this mesmerizing story, and for also showing how some of these basic facts that are indeed in the thematic map can help to interpret these sort of very complex and momentous events that we see. And also well done for outrunning the PowerPoint. It was great to see. As a discussant, final discussant of the day, we have Mohamed Salih, who is Professor of Politics and Development at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague and the Department of Political Science at the University of Leiden. Professor Salih has been a prolific researcher with interests covering all aspects of the politics of development, and has a regional focus on Africa and the Middle East, and is an expert also on the Sudan and Ethiopia.
He's lying, he's lying.
I'm trying not to.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. Let me start by thanking my colleagues at the African Studies Centre. I always tell my old friend, Leo Duhan, that this is the only African institute we have in the Netherlands. And of course, I am very proud of it. And also, I thank my colleague in Abbink for a very clear and very persuasive argument, but I'm not here, of course, to give only praise, affirmation, and confirmation. I also have to do some few things to justify my journey from The Hague to Leiden, which is a long one. Professor Abbink reminds us that demography is politics, not only in determining the number of electoral constituencies, equitable distribution of wealth, and factors of development among regions or between subnational entities and the central government, et cetera, et cetera. So that relationship is well established. The only problem with demography is that it is abstracted in terms of population. Well, I'm not a Marxist, but Marx always tells us that please unpack population. There are classes, there are different genders, cultures, identities, so on and so forth. But if demographies go before this notion of abstract population and unpacked in terms of its constituencies, of course, you can have a better picture of the relationship between demography and politics. But also, I think what is interesting about this keynote to speak is that it has some resonance and implications beyond Sudan and Ethiopia, and as he mentioned, could also be relevant to other African countries, also with similar demographic characteristics. So, my two critical points based on the likelihood which Jan tries to dismiss, the possibility of demographic determinism, the number 2627, and also the possibility that the opportunity for rebellion where poorly educated youth or educated youth with no job opportunities, social services, and better standard of living would revolt. Of course, it is true, not only to the population of these two countries, youth of these countries, but also to other countries as well. And therefore, the tension between agency and structure is not inherent, according to me, in that particular age group. It is determined by the socioeconomic and environmental conditions available to people, regardless of age. I don't like to mention the World Bank or the IMF because their statistics give us a completely different perspective. I don't like to believe it, but if I don't have my alternative statistics, what can I do? I can say, okay, they said it. In fact, the population, within this population of median of 25 years, unemployment is very low. It's very strange. The World Bank gives ridiculous figures. I don't even have to mention them. I will be ashamed of myself. Something between 2.7 to 3%. Of course, this would have implications of the core of the argument that we have here, this increasing population, the median of 25 years, which to me it carries that deterministic viewpoint. So at the largest synthesis, it could be understood that demographic shifts lead directly, even though Jan says it is not causal relationship, to more fundamental questions. And those questions, of course, regard the distribution of power and the capacities of government and the formation and influence of ethnic, cultural, regional, and other identities on democratic governance and political stability. Age itself cannot be a determinant factor. There are two conclusions which I think are pivotal constitutions, but maybe they are also contestable. Youth protests are destined to continue as long as the current demographic and other structural factors that negatively affect their economic, political, and social aspirations and well-being have not changed. I think that is a very strong conclusion. On the one side, you can agree with it. On the other side, also, you can try to steer some few issues for the sake of the discussion. And therefore, we have this tension between youth agency and the governing political structures, pointing to the fact that they have two different, or seem to be having two different interests. And these interests are not reconcilable. Now, two questions with this conclusion. Number one, we forget that youth as an age group is highly differentiated. They belong to different classes, they belong to different social backgrounds, political backgrounds, and all of that. We cannot count on their number as being a signpost of a particular political orientation, class, or level of well-being. They're different. They are the very poor, and they are the ones who are in the middle class, and they are those and this and that. But also, we don't forget that the current youth are better educated than their parents. And they do have access to political avenues for connectivity, even much better than their parents, and probably not different from youth in any other part of the world, but maybe their opportunities are not as huge as the youth in the Netherlands. Those youth, for some reason, they do have the capacity to relocate their political energy outside conventional politics. They are not the guys in the political parties. Some of them by age, of course, can be excluded. They are not the guys in the parliament. Of course, by age, they can be excluded. And at the same time, they are not the leaders of the trade unions. They are not the leaders of these big professional associations and all of that, NGOs. They are not. And this gives them the possibility of using the information technology to relocate their politics in ways that probably were not available to my own generation, the way they mobilize. It's not only mobilization, but also changing the nature of what you call collective action. Well, if the leaders of today's collective action was using the radio from the neighboring countries and so on and so forth, today it's completely different. Even the radio has acquired a new meaning and much more simpler to do with your computer, and you can transmit using all different. So for me, I think we have to unpack this youth and to see how differentiated it is and what kind of access to alternative venues of political expression that they have, other conventional politics. The second one is that, and this is almost a quotation, that Sudan and Ethiopia are not yet in an age structural transition, and this is why political stability and broad growth are unlikely, perhaps not yet occurred. Now, he says the gains are precarious and reversible, and I'm interested in the word reversible. The rest of the talking is interesting, but the word reversible is interesting. Due to objective democratic characteristics. Again, demographic determinism. I think if the two countries have similarities and differences, then I would like probably to argue that what makes them reversible probably is not an objective democratic, or that they have not reached the democratic window, a demographic window of 26, 27, but probably with factors that are inherent to each political and economic system and regimes that they have. But the conclusion itself is important. I question reversibility. I think it is irreversible. I can give you reasons. In Sudan, it's irreversible because there is today the realization in the Sudan that liberation struggle is ended. Because my good colleague, he is correct. The changes happened, not peacefully, of course, some people died, but if you compare it with the struggle that these liberation movements were having already since 1985, even a little bit earlier, maybe 2 or 3 years earlier, until today, they have not made any gains. In fact, now they are negotiating with a regime that has been changed by civilians without the use of gun by the side of the civilians. I think when you think that the use of liberation struggle is, to me, is no longer an option for the generation that my colleague is talking about, the post-Bashir generation, then I see, then you ask the question, where is the reversibility going to come from? Of course, there are two sources. The old political regime, the so-called deep state, because of its control of the economy and the means of livelihood of the people, and the second is the army. The army is out of the question. But at the same time, the Islamists themselves, they knew that. I'm sure some of you must have seen the 3 programs that came from Al Arabiya News, Al Arabiya TV, about the last meetings of the National Congress Party and how they were controlling Sudan and Sudan economy and everything, where they were saying that you just from the way you enter the ministry, you know, the watchman or the guard is a Muslim brother, and then all the directors of the ministry and so and so and so, why have not been able to control the state. But also at the same time they said, we have been using the resources of the state to finance our political party, and so on and so forth. So there is, my good colleague, I think some of the internal processes in Sudan will make reversibility almost impossible. With Ethiopia also, I think reversibility to what and who is to bring the reverse. Now, ethnically, Ethiopia has entered a new phase. That is what you call it, political system fragmentation, whereby there is no one single political entity, ethnic or ideological, so on and so forth, that can make a majority that can control and govern Ethiopia single-handed. That is finished. The army is so divided. So in both cases, reversibility means, of course, the collapse of the 2 states. To reverse what is happening in Ethiopia today, of course you are opting for a civil war. How you reverse it to what regime? I mean, to go back to Mengistu, that is the army, with a different ideological orientation, or to go back to Meles Zenawi with EPRDF, forget about it. Sudan also. So reversibility in the second conclusion interests me. Now, these conclusions also raise some theoretical questions. I don't mind to mention many, but I want to mention only 2. Very quickly, okay. If we believe in waiting until the demographic opening or demographic window occurs, in fact, we risk reducing the factors that inhibit or augur political transformation to an expanding youth population, therefore using youth as a scapegoat for government failure. We shift the burden of blame from government to people who increase for no mistake other than their parents, because they are the ones who gave birth to them. So the problem can be read as if the propagates of the idea that a useful, angry, marginalized youth is a problem, and that also it has the capacity to topple governments and generate political instability, but yet incapable or not capable to change the economic status quo, that is the structure, to the better, it is in itself problematic. And this, of course, my colleague could be right, but not because of the sheer numbers, maybe for the other one. The second theoretical issue here is that focusing on youth deprivation replaces the Malthusian focus on the role of population pressure on natural resources that produces scarcity. And that scarcity, of course, produces conflict, upheavals, all different other things. What we have done by this analysis theoretically is very simple. We replaced the natural resources with the social and economic resources. Employment, social services, income became the resources that replaces the natural resources. Of course, the equation is simple. The outcome is political instability. And therefore, all the critique of the Malthusian theorists and new Malthusian theories as well can also brought to question, because they question also the very essence of, simply not because they forgot the technology and all of that. Youth, of course, there are many ways of absorbing youth in much more useful ways of dealing with their reality. So I just want to stop here, even though I have some other things, so maybe later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We just wanted to make a little bit of time for questions. Jan, do you want to respond quickly to this, or do you want to take questions?
Well, briefly, yeah.
With the mic, please. That's right. It's on. It's on.
It's on, okay. Mohamed, thank you very much for going very thoroughly through the paper and responding to crucial issues. I mean, what my intention was also in playing with this age structural theory is to see in how far it holds, in how far a research program combining political, sociological analysis and demographic analysis is useful. I think we cannot do either the one or the other, but we have to combine them. I'm not pleading for demographic determinism. If that's the impression I try to convey, then I'm wrong. As I said, you can use demographic analysis, political demography analysis for, you know, projecting timed expectations, which are often in many contexts corroborated by the facts. Tunisia, Mauritius and other countries. And Algeria now, the Algeria scenario now, there's a high chance that Algeria right now in the throngs of huge protest and pressure on the government is going to follow the Tunisia scenario. That was also predicted about 10 years ago by proponents of this theory. So what I'm doing is only to see in how far insights into the demographic facts, as far as we know them, can help us to interpret these processes. The specific issues you mentioned, is it true that, employment among the category of 27-year-old people and higher is low? No, that's exactly the point. Then they start becoming integrated into that whole movement, and then the dependency ratio will decline. That's the crucial issue, is that. In your anyway, many things you mentioned. In your theoretical issues, of course, we should not wait for the demographic window. I mean, we should not wait for it. As I said twice in my presentation, government policy is crucial in advancing it. But if you do nothing, ceteris paribus, so to speak, you know, whatever the composition of the protesting people, there will be a delay in entering the phase of the different composition of the population, which will have an impact, I think. The second point, I could not quite understand about the neo-Malthusian argument. I mean, we don't like neo-Malthusian arguments. Nobody likes it. It's politically also not correct. But I mean,
this is a political analogy.
Yeah.
It's a political analogy.
Yeah.
It's a physical environment analogy.
Yeah. Well, the main thing is we have to look at these criteria. What is the dependency ratio? What is the median age? There you see a kind of very consistent dynamics in populations across the continent. If these relationships change, the chances for the impact of new reform policies are higher. If the relationships keep the same, you will continue to have rebellions, revolts of people in that country. No doubt about it, I think. Anyway, my pleading is for developing a kind of research program to really actually test that more and better in the African context. And that is, what I would say now, and keep my mouth shut.
Thank you very much. Questions? It's harder to see. Okay, I have one question here, and then I think one in the back. Yeah? Maaike? Oh. Well, no.
Yes, so thank you for your insightful comments, information. I have actually a question with respect to the demographic window, but the bounds of the demographic window, the relationship between, is there a relationship between the demographic window and average life expectancy? Because as we've seen, people are getting older and older, and I would just like to know if there is such a relationship that maybe the bounds shift or the whole window itself shifts as people get older. So I wanted to know if you maybe could touch on that.
And then there was a question all the way in the back.
Thank you for the interesting lectures. I have two questions about today's presentation. The first question is that we have seen a very big structural change in Sudan and Ethiopia. Geographically, Eritrea is located between those two countries. Situation in Eritrea is, from my personal viewpoint, more harsh than in those two countries. But there is no yet any political or structural change. From both of you, from your point of view, why there is no change in Eritrea, despite there is change in the neighboring countries? The second question is, there is, in Ethiopia these days, there is a big tension among the great antagonistic ethnic groups. From your own viewpoint, what will be the future of Ethiopia?
Yeah, thank you for intriguing questions.
Please, the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for heavy questions. I mean, intriguing questions, heavy ones to answer. I mean, the first one on age and the shifting, changing life expectancy and its effect. I'm not sure how to answer that. I am not really a proponent or an adherent of this AST. I want to explore the implications of that for these population balances, but I would expect that when the population of elderly people is increasing, we have a higher dependency ratio, which is a matter of great challenge and concern for any country. We see it even in Holland, not in the terms of the politics, because the history of let's say a deliberative democratic system is well rooted in at least in Holland or in other European countries. But not so in Africa, and I think it will have an impact in putting pressure on the economically active population vis-à-vis the dependent population. But the implications of that in Africa have been, I think, not so much studied. So I cannot really give a convincing answer on that point. I must admit. We don't have enough analysis on that. I think we have no good interpretation on that. On the Eritrea issue, yeah, that's this theory. I mean, I've been looking at some authors like Cincotta, like Goldstone and Chuba and so forth. They say that there is, of course, disparity in the countries and in the political conditions, ideological conditions of the countries. Even in China, in China they have entered the demographic window, of course. I mean, in terms of the dependency ratio, the median age has gone up and so forth. But it's still the same strongly authoritarian, non-democratic country. It depends on what Cincotta says. It depends on the strength of the ideological regime and in its longevity, whether they can ward off the effects which seem to be associated with entering the demographic window. And in the case of China and in the case of Eritrea and North Korea also probably, these regimes are so well established in terms of their hegemonic structures that they have no serious challenge. In Eritrea it's helped also by scale. It's a small society, not more than 5.5 million, 6 million people. It's a kind of big village. I mean, it's the control possibilities and the diversity among the publics, among the constituencies is smaller in Eritrea, which gives the regime a much better grip on the population. I think that's one of the big reasons. It's not that's why I'm against, and that's why the theory is also against determinism in demography. There is no such thing as that determinism. Many factors from the political domain, from the specific political history of the countries, interfere with the expression and the unfolding of demographic facts. That is absolutely also something we historians, anthropologists have to constantly emphasize in terms of in theory vis-à-vis people who get carried away by the demographic trends. Ethiopia, the future of Ethiopia, that is the question which all bothers us, and it keeps us occupied. People who have been professionally studying that country. Yeah, I think, I mean, as I said in my concluding thoughts, I mean, comparing Sudan and Ethiopia, surprisingly, I hear myself say that I'm more pessimistic about Ethiopia than about Sudan. Really. The manner in which the enormous challenge offered, or not challenge, but also opportunities offered by this new regime under Abiy Ahmed, his rhetoric, his concrete measures, his extremely inclusive narrative, which was unprecedented in Ethiopian history, has been thwarted or abused or sidelined by certain political players, political actors, is to me somewhat shocking. I mean, people do not seem to take up possibilities which the new political landscape in Ethiopia has offered. They insist on reverting to a victimhood, a collective identity narrative, which will, you know, not only undermine a kind of discourse about a shared political future, but it would also enhance local conflicts between certain groups. And we have seen it already. I mean, displacements, riots have been occurring after he came to power. So it makes me a bit worried about the future. And then people say, yeah, that is because of Abiy Ahmed's dumb policies and so forth. No, it is because, of course, he makes mistakes. He has maybe even taken too many risks in trying to restructure the landscape very fast and inviting all these people back. But it seems the case that the inculcated ideology, the cultural, the political ideologies which have been inculcated by a whole generation of Ethiopians since '91, ethnic federalism, you know, ethnic federalism, is very tenacious in the minds of people. Political imagination in Ethiopia is totally captured by ethnicity. There is no other political imagination emerging yet, except in some urban areas. There was an initiative called Destiny Ethiopia. You know, many kind of intellectuals, professionals, and so forth who were discussing on the possibilities of a shared country and a shared narrative and so forth. But these are minorities, and that makes me a bit worried about the future of the country. As I suggested, and what Mohamed also mentioned, is the issue of reversibility, irreversibility of change. I think in Ethiopia is very much reversible. I mean, the gains made are totally reversible. Some countries enter the demographic window too early, so to speak. I mean, some of the theorists have mentioned countries which started promisingly in a kind of, you know, started well on the freedom score, started to develop a democratic deliberative structure, and then had a serious relapse. This can also happen in Ethiopia if the narrative is not going to change. So, and it is not helped if the demographic dynamics are not changing. Then the tendencies will be reinforced, I think.
Prof, do you want to add?
Well, I think I agree with Jan to some extent, but something that intrigues me about the Ethiopian elite, both educated and political. Their disengagement with political, collective political action. Like what you see here in Sudan in these demonstrations, there are university professors, there are lecturers, there are people from high school, there are all of that. In Ethiopia, they are different. It is almost like the mob, you know. And to a very large extent, this, their urban base is just beginning to take root, because most of the rebellion were peasantry. Yeah? It is over land, it is over ethnic issues that are discussed at the subnational level. But also, as an imperial regime in the past, and I think this is a point that, in terms of a structure that Jan has really demonstrated, institutions stick in the mentality of many of the Ethiopian elite. Still, they still behave and carry themselves vis-à-vis the masses, almost like royals, or it is very strange, the relationship between, of course, Abbink politics is somehow different because he's a guy who comes with his short sleeves and sometimes with a t-shirt. It's unheard of in the Ethiopians. There is always this huge distance. But don't forget also, the Ethiopian masses and peasants' capacity of endurance is just unbelievable. But that is why the reverse to it is that once that endurance reaches its limit, they also act very instantaneously and also very violently. Now, to what extent the elite still have some charm offensive to keep the country together, I think it is a question that we must ask ourselves. In the case of Sudan, I think there is one new, it's not new, it is new and old. The emergence of the commander or the leader of the Rapid Response Force, Hemeti. He's from the Rezegat ethnic group, the Bagara, from Western Sudan. And for the Sudanese who know the history of Sudan very well, Hemeti seems like an incarnation of new Mahdism. The people who come, the Bagara people, because they were the mainstay of the Mahdiya army from Western Sudan, particularly the Bagara. And the Khalifa of the Mahdi, Abdullah al-Ta'ashi, he's a Bagara also. He's the same ethnic group as this Hemeti and many other guys who were associated with Janjaweed and others. The question that is this Hemeti phenomenon is looked at in marginalized Sudan, particularly in some parts of Kordofan and the Bagara belt, all the way from Sudan, Chad, and Niger, is seen as it is the first time after 100 years that the people of Western Sudan have an army in the capital. They were thrown out by the Anglo-British rule long time ago. And they see it as a safety valve for the continuity of the current regime, which of course includes so many people from marginalized Sudan, particularly from Western Sudan. 6 of them in the Council of Ministers, and 4 also in the Sovereign Council. So this is also a new dynamic. In fact, one reason why a military coup did not take place and we have now a civilian rule is simply because Hemeti discourse to all the military leaders is that if you start a military coup, certainly the Sudan is not going to be the same again, because I am not going to be with you to integrate my army in the Sudanese army, because it is the first time that for us from a particular part of Western Sudan, of course we know Hemeti is detested, of course, by Darfurians and all of that, because the Janjaweed are part of that. But still, I was witness to some talks happen between the political leaders. They want some remorse from him so that they can join together in that army. If today we have the demobilization of the forces, I assure you that the majority of those who are demobilized from Western Sudan will join Hamad team to reinforce the presence, the military presence of people, or particular people from Western Sudan with a military force in the capital. Something that they haven't had for the last 100 years. So in a sense, this gives, it is almost like a preemptive, some sort of, there is a force there that does not belong to the military force that we know, where the leadership, all of it is from Central and from Northern Sudan, and the foot soldiers are from Western Sudan, Eastern Sudan in the past and the South, and also people from the far North, because they are as poor as the people from the East and the West. And this in itself is a factor of stability. It's not fragile. It's very, very strong. The military presence of the Rapid Response Force, it is very, very strong. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No. So in terms of time, I had one more question. Well, what I would like to suggest is that we don't answer the question. So we end with a question.
Maybe that's actually quite appropriate, because I wanted to make a comment on the whole exercise, which is a little bit unfair to do it now. Because I would like to congratulate Jon Abbink and Professor Salih for daring to look into the future, which very few intellectuals actually, or academics dare to do. But if I look at the whole sort of event, which was very impressive, I enjoyed all the talks. It was very much dominated by two topics. It was dominated by decoloniality, and South Africa. Maybe there's actually a link there. And I'm wondering if, if you stage a discussion on Africa 60 years of independence in terms of a dialogue about these topics, and very much as a black-white dialogue, a dialogue between Europe and Africa, which is looking very much back by its nature, whether that doesn't bring to mind, Hegel famously said, the owl of the Minerva only flies in the dusk. So we are maybe at the end of a historical chapter, and it's already maybe dark, and we have not seen outside that there is maybe a new dawn. I think what would be important maybe for future events in this year is to look a little bit outside this particular frame. In particular, if you want to take serious what Eliseo Makamo said, looking at Africa is looking at the world, and some people say we are in the midst of a huge geopolitical shift in the world, in the globe. I mean, the rise of Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, and there was nothing on this. So I regret this a little bit, because I think in the future these Afro-European debates, they will be trilateral or four-lateral and so on. So I think there was maybe quite a lot of what's happening in the world sort of missing in the debate, and I think it should be brought in this year, or when you have in 10 years' time 70 years of independence in Africa. So it's more comment than a question.
Thank you. So sometimes things work out. I think you're totally right, and that's why this is the beginning of the year. This is very much the first event of the, I'm a little bit serious. This was the beginning of the year to look back on these 60 years and what's happened and what people are studying about this and that has an aula Minerva, which in the Dutch context has a complicated connotation at the moment, but a very negative one. But internationally, yes, this is aula Minerva kind of element. But in the rest of the year, this is very much not, and it's a perfect bridge. But let me first thank you, both gentlemen, for wonderful talks and inspiring stories. Perfectly on time. We're here. You have done incredibly well. We'll have to save discussions until the end. And it's not even comments. No, sorry. We'll have to. This was the last one. This was the very last one. Quick things. Thank you to all the speakers, all the discussants, everyone who's organized this, Maaike, Ton, Jan Bart, Fenneke, Rick, all the students and all the staff here that I'm forgetting. A huge applause to you. Thank you very much. And then following on from this perfectly timed comment, a huge invitation to everyone to come and join in all the activities that we're organizing this year. Also, if you're interested, I mean, we're very inclusive, so just email either Mike or Ton or me and join in the things that are already being organized. If you have good ideas for new things that you think would fit under the umbrella, also very, very welcome. This website program is very much in development, so anything is welcome. And do indeed look out for this conference at the end of the year, which hopefully very much focuses not on what's missing and not on, I mean, partly on what's happening here, but also very much on what's actually happening on the ground in all of these, the range of African countries. So a huge invitation to join in all of the activities this year, and then finally an invitation to continue talking about the legacies of colonialism under the comfort of a drink. Thank you very much for coming.